The high school cafeteria was buzzing with the usual lunchtime chaos, students chatting, laughter echoing, and the occasional clatter of trays. 17-year-old Malik Johnson moved through the crowd, balancing his tray of food. He had just finished AP History, and his mind was still replaying the class discussion on civil rights. It had been heated, but nothing prepared him for what was about to happen next. Malik wasn't looking for trouble. He rarely did. But trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding him. As he reached his usual table, a sharp voice cut through the noise. "You people are everywhere these days," sneered Deborah Wallace, a senior who carried herself like she owned the place. Malik paused, unsure if she was talking to him. The cafeteria went quiet just for a second, like the room itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. He turned to see Deborah staring straight at him, her arms crossed, an unmistakable look of disdain on her face. "Excuse me," Malik said, keeping his voice even. Deborah smirked. Malik's voice was calm, but his heart pounded. He had dealt with ignorance before, but something about the way Deborah was looking at him made this feel different, like she was waiting for a reaction. "You heard me," Deborah said, her smirk widening as she leaned back against the table behind her. "I just don't get why people like you think you belong here." A few gasps rippled through the cafeteria. Students who had been absorbed in their conversations were now turning their heads, eyes darting between Malik and Deborah. Malik inhaled deeply. "Pick your battles," his mother's voice echoed in his head. But before he could decide whether to engage or walk away, Deborah wasn't done. "You know, back in the day, things were different," she continued, her voice carrying across the room. "Now? It's like this country just lets anyone in. Maybe you should go back to Africa where you came from." Silence, heavy, uncomfortable. Even the usual cafeteria chatter had died down. All eyes were on them. Some students looked stunned, others exchanged nervous glances. A few smirked, entertained by the brewing conflict. Malik felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. Not again. Not this time. He could walk away. He could ignore her. But then what? Let her believe she could say whatever she wanted without consequence? No, not today. With steady hands, Malik set his tray down and turned to face Deborah fully. "You want to run that by me again?" he said, his voice even but filled with something deeper. The cafeteria held its breath. Deborah's smirk faltered. Malik wasn't about to let this slide, and neither was the crowd. The cafeteria felt different now, charged, expectant. The silence wasn't empty, it was waiting. Deborah's smirk wavered for the briefest second before she folded her arms across her chest. "I said what I said." Malik didn't blink. "Yeah, and what exactly do you think you're saying?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Deborah scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, come on. You act like I'm the only one thinking it. Half of these people agree with me. They're just too scared to say it." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some students shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided eye contact, but no one spoke up. That was the worst part. Not her words. The silence. Malik exhaled, shaking his head. "You really believe that, huh? That people like me don't belong here?" Deborah shrugged. "It's not personal. It's just facts." "Facts?" Malik repeated. His jaw clenched, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he took a step forward. "All right, let's talk facts." He glanced around the cafeteria, making sure everyone was listening. "Fact, my ancestors didn't just come here. They were brought here, in chains. They built this country, its roads, its buildings, its economy, while people like your ancestors sat back and profited." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Damn." Malik wasn't finished. "Fact, black soldiers fought in every war, defending a country that barely defended them in return. Fact, the very rights you take for granted, voting, education, even sitting in this cafeteria, were fought for by people who looked like me." Deborah shifted, crossing her arms tighter. "Oh, please." "No," Malik cut in. "You don't get to, oh, please me." The cafeteria wasn't just listening now. They were feeling it. Deborah opened her mouth, but for the first time she didn't have anything to say. The weight of Malik's words hung in the air, thick and unshakable. The cafeteria had never been this quiet, not even during tests. Deborah opened her mouth again, trying to regain control, but before she could speak, Malik took another step forward. His presence wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniable. "You think telling me to go back to Africa is an insult?" he asked. "You think it makes you powerful?" Deborah scoffed. I don't care, Malik. It's just, no, you do care. His voice was steady, unwavering. You care enough to say it out loud. You care enough to try and make me feel less. Some students murmured in agreement. Deborah's confidence flickered. Malik continued, his eyes locked onto hers. You want to talk about Africa? Let's do that. He took a deep breath. My roots trace back to the greatest civilizations in history. Kingdoms of gold and knowledge, empires that existed before this country was even an idea. Scientists, architects, warriors, scholars, all of that is in my blood. A few students nodded. Others were whispering now. Deborah, however, rolled her eyes. Yeah? Then why are you even here? Malik smiled. Not the kind that showed amusement, the kind that knew it had already won. I'm here because my ancestors survived everything that was meant to break them. I'm here because no amount of hate, oppression, or ignorance has ever erased our strength. And I'm here because, like it or not, this country, it's just as much mine as it is yours. The shift was visible. Deborah had started this thinking she had control, but now the power had moved, and the entire cafeteria could feel it. The tension in the cafeteria was no longer just about Malik and Deborah, it was spreading. Whispers turned into murmurs, and soon voices started speaking up. That was deep, someone muttered. He's got a point, another student added. Deborah, still standing stiffly, crossed her arms. Oh, so now everyone's on his side? Just because he gave some speech? It's not just a speech, a girl named Vanessa shot back. She was one of the most popular students in school, and her voice carried weight. It's the truth. Deborah's face twisted with frustration. Whatever. You guys always play the victim, always bringing up history like it means something now. Malik let out a small chuckle. History? You mean the same history that still affects people today? The history that built this country on the backs of people like me, but somehow still makes you feel entitled to tell me where I do or don't belong. The cafeteria exploded with reactions. Some students clapped. Others gasped at Malik's boldness. A few even started recording on their phones. Deborah's frustration turned into desperation. You're twisting everything. I didn't mean it like, oh, you meant it exactly like that. Malik interrupted, his voice sharp but calm. You just weren't ready for someone to challenge you on it. A guy from the basketball team, Jamal, stood up. Man, you really thought you could say something like that and nobody would call you out? Deborah looked around, searching for support. A few of her usual friends looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up. For the first time since this started, Deborah realized she was losing. Just as the cafeteria buzz grew louder, the double doors swung open and a sharp voice cut through the chaos. What's going on here? Principal Harris, a tall, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s, strode into the room with authority. Behind her, Mr. Thompson, the history teacher, followed closely. The sight of faculty immediately sent a ripple of silence through the crowd. Students quickly tucked their phones away, but it was too late. Enough people had recorded the incident for it to spread. Deborah, still flustered, saw her chance. She turned to the principal, her face red with anger and embarrassment. Principal Harris, Malik just started attacking me in front of everyone. You were just what, exactly? Principal Harris asked, her piercing gaze locking onto Deborah. Malik took a deep breath. He didn't want to sound emotional or defensive. He wanted to be heard. She told me to go back to Africa, like I don't belong here. A hush fell over the room again. Principal Harris's expression darkened. Mr. Thompson crossed his arms, shaking his head. Deborah scoffed. I didn't mean it like that. Then how did you mean it? Mr. Thompson asked, stepping forward. Because from what I've heard, it sounds exactly how it was meant. Some students murmured in agreement. Malik felt a surge of support behind him. Principal Harris sighed, rubbing her temples. Deborah, my office. Now. Deborah's jaw dropped. But, now, Principal Harris repeated, her voice final. Deborah hesitated, then turned on her heel and stormed off. But before she left, she shot Malik a glare filled with resentment. Malik exhaled. The situation wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like justice was starting to take shape. Malik sat outside Principal Harris's office, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee. The tension from the cafeteria still clung to him, but he wasn't alone. Several students had already started speaking up in his defense. Even Mr. Thompson had stayed behind, offering him a reassuring nod. Inside the office, Deborah sat with her arms crossed, her face still flushed with frustration. "I don't see why this is such a big deal," she muttered. Principal Harris folded her hands on the desk, her expression unreadable. "Deborah, do you understand the weight of what you said?" "It was just a joke," Deborah insisted, rolling her eyes. "A joke?" Principal Harris leaned forward, her voice firm. "Telling someone to go back to Africa isn't a joke. It's a statement rooted in racism, in exclusion, and in a history of oppression. It tells someone they don't belong when they absolutely do." Deborah looked away, her jaw tightening. "I didn't mean it like that." "Intent doesn't erase impact," Mr. Thompson chimed in. "What you said was harmful, Deborah. You need to take responsibility." There was a long silence. Deborah shifted uncomfortably, her fingers fidgeting with her sleeve. Meanwhile, outside the office, Malik overheard bits of the conversation. He felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, but also a sense of hope. For once, an authority figure wasn't brushing things under the rug. Finally, Principal Harris spoke again. "Deborah, there will be consequences. This school has a zero-tolerance policy for hate speech, and you've crossed a serious line." Deborah swallowed hard, realizing that this wasn't going away as easily as she thought. Malik took a deep breath. No matter what happened next, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting a precedent, one that needed to be set. Malik sat across from Deborah, the air thick with tension. Principal Harris had made it clear Deborah needed to take responsibility for her words. But would she? "I didn't mean to be racist," Deborah muttered, staring at the floor. Malik folded his arms. "You told me to go back to Africa. Do you understand what that means? What that implies?" Deborah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I was mad. I stand against racism, equality for all, speak up, justice matters, end discrimination, change starts with you, unity and diversity, respect for all. Stop the hate, #inclusion matters, watched her closely, waiting for her response. "I don't know," Deborah admitted, her voice quiet. "I guess I just never thought about it. My dad says stuff like that sometimes, and That's the problem," Malik interrupted. "You don't think about it. You don't think about what it's like for people like me. You don't think about how we have to work twice as hard just to be treated like we belong. You just repeat what you hear." Deborah's face turned red. "I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," Malik said. "But now you do. So what are you going to do about it?" Principal Harris leaned forward. "Deborah, an apology isn't just about saying sorry. It's about understanding the harm you caused and making a real effort to do better. Are you ready for that?" Deborah swallowed hard. I think so." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Think so?" Deborah sighed. "I mean, yes, I owe you an apology. A real one." Malik nodded. "Then say it." The room fell silent. Would she finally take responsibility? Deborah took a deep breath, her fingers clenched together in her lap. The entire room waited for her next words. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Malik stared at her, unimpressed. "Sorry for what?" Deborah's eyes darted to Principal Harris, as if hoping he'd rescue her from this moment. But the principal remained silent, waiting for her to take full accountability. "I'm sorry for telling you to go back to Africa," she mumbled. Malik sighed. "That's not enough. You're just repeating what you said before. Do you even know why it was wrong?" Deborah hesitated, shifting in her seat. "Because it was mean?" Malik shook his head. "No. Because it's a racist insult used to tell black people that we don't belong here. It's used to dismiss us, to make us feel like we're outsiders, even though this is our home too. I was born here, just like you." Deborah bit her lip. "I didn't think about it that way." "That's the problem," Malik said. "You didn't think at all, and if Principal Harris hadn't stepped in, you probably wouldn't have cared." A heavy silence filled the office. "I do care," Deborah finally admitted. "I didn't mean to hurt you like that. I was angry, but that's not an excuse. I shouldn't have said it." Malik studied her for a long moment. "So what are you going to do now?" Deborah exhaled slowly. I guess I have a lot to learn." Principal Harris nodded. "And that's exactly where change begins." For the first time, Deborah seemed to truly understand. But would understanding be enough? By the time news of the incident spread through the school, it had ignited a firestorm of conversations. Students whispered in hallways, teachers exchanged concerned glances, and social media was flooded with discussions. "Did you hear what happened to Malik?" one student asked at lunch. Yeah, Deborah told him to go back to Africa. That's messed up, another replied, shaking their head. Some students defended Malik outright, while others downplayed the incident, saying it was just an argument. But the overwhelming response was clear. People were paying attention. In the teacher's lounge, several staff members debated how to handle the situation. This isn't just about two students arguing, Mrs. Thompson, the history teacher, said. This is a chance to educate all of them about racism. I agree, Mr. Carter added, but we need to be careful. We can't just single out Deborah as the villain. We have to use this moment to teach, not just punish. Meanwhile, Malik walked through the hallways, feeling the weight of 1,000 stares. Some students patted him on the back in support, while others avoided eye contact. He noticed Deborah sitting at a table alone, pushing her food around on her tray. She looked different, not as defensive, almost like she was processing everything. Then, an unexpected voice spoke up. I think we need to have a school-wide discussion, Principal Harris announced over the intercom. Not just about what happened, but about respect, history, and the importance of understanding each other. Tomorrow, we'll be holding an assembly. Everyone will be there. The room buzzed with reactions. An assembly? Malik felt a mix of emotions. Was this going to be performative, or was real change actually happening? The next morning, the entire school gathered in the auditorium. The energy in the room was thick with anticipation. Students whispered, some curious, others skeptical about what was about to happen. Teachers sat in rows, their expressions serious, while Principal Harris stood at the podium, waiting for silence. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice firm but calm. We are here today because of an incident that took place in our school, an incident that forces us to have a conversation we should have had a long time ago. Malik sat in the front row, his hands clasped together. He wasn't sure what to expect. Was this going to be a lecture about school unity, or something real? As educators, it is our responsibility to ensure that every student feels safe and respected, Principal Harris continued. But respect isn't just a rule in a handbook. It's about how we treat each other, how we listen, and how we learn from history. The students listened, some leaning forward with interest, others looking bored. Then, to everyone's surprise, Principal Harris turned toward Malik. Malik, would you be willing to come up and share your thoughts? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Malik hadn't expected this. His heart pounded, but he knew this was important. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and walked toward the stage. As he reached the microphone, he looked out at the hundreds of students staring at him. Deborah was in the back, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I didn't expect to be up here today, Malik started, his voice steady. But if we're really going to talk about respect, then we need to be honest. What happened wasn't just an insult. It was a reminder that people still see me as less than because of my skin color. The room fell silent. Malik took a breath. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to waste it. Malik gripped the edges of the podium, his heart steadying as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. He knew he had their attention now, but what he said next would determine whether they actually listened. I've been told to go back to Africa before, he said, his voice calm but firm. But let's talk about what that actually means. Some students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, intrigued. My ancestors didn't get a choice in coming here, Malik continued. They were kidnapped, taken from their homes, and forced onto ships in chains. They were brought to a land that treated them as property, not people. And for centuries, Black Americans have had to fight for the rights that some of you take for granted every single day. A few murmurs spread through the crowd. Malik caught a glimpse of Deborah in the back, her arms crossed tightly. We built this country, Malik said, his voice rising with conviction. From the railroads to the White House itself, from music to literature to scientific breakthroughs, Black people have been here, contributing, leading, and shaping America. So when someone tells me to go back to Africa, what they're really saying is that they don't know history. Silence. One of the history teachers in the audience nodded, clearly impressed. A few students exchanged glances, as if seeing Malik in a new light. He let his words hang in the air for a moment before stepping away from the mic. Principal Harris returned to the podium. Thank you, Malik. That was powerful. Malik sat back down, exhaling. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: his voice had been heard. As Malik took his seat, the atmosphere in the auditorium felt different. The weight of his words lingered in the air, sinking into the minds of those who had listened. Some students sat in stunned silence, while others whispered among themselves, processing what they had just heard. Deborah, the girl who had made the racist remark, stared straight ahead, her face tense. It was clear she hadn't expected Malik to respond the way he had. Instead of yelling or getting defensive, he had used knowledge and truth to dismantle her ignorance in front of everyone. Principal Harris cleared her throat. I think Malik's words should remind all of us about the importance of understanding history, of respecting one another, and of standing up against ignorance. She turned to Deborah. Would you like to say anything in response? Deborah hesitated. Her usual confidence had been stripped away. She glanced around, realizing all eyes were on her. She started, then sighed. I didn't mean it like that. I guess I just never really thought about it before. Malik raised an eyebrow. And now? Deborah looked down at her hands, fidgeting. Now I realize how wrong I was. I'm sorry. A few students gasped. No one had expected an apology, especially not in front of the entire school. Malik nodded. Apology accepted, but remember, words have weight. What you say can hurt people, or it can open doors for understanding. It's up to you to choose wisely. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that signaled change. A lesson had been learned, not just by Deborah, but by everyone in the room. For the first time that day, Malik felt something close to victory. After the assembly, students poured out of the auditorium, still buzzing from what had happened. Some walked up to Malik, nodding in respect, while others whispered about how they had never thought of things the way he explained them. Yo, Malik, called out Jordan, one of his classmates. Man, that was powerful. I never really thought about history like that. You really put things in perspective. Malik smiled. That's the thing, bro. A lot of people don't think about it until they have to. Even some teachers stopped him in the hallway to acknowledge his words. You showed incredible wisdom today, said Mr. Lewis, his history teacher. I hope more students take the time to educate themselves like you have. But the biggest surprise came when Deborah approached him after class. She looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot before speaking. Listen, she said hesitantly, I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I really do feel bad about what I said. Malik studied her for a moment. It's not just about feeling bad, Deborah. It's about learning and doing better. Ignorance isn't an excuse when we have all the knowledge in the world at our fingertips. She nodded. I get that, and well, I was wondering if you could recommend some books or something. I want to understand more. Malik was taken aback. He had expected her apology, but not this. He could see in her eyes that she was serious. Yeah, he said finally. I'll send you a list. For the first time since the incident, Deborah smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of genuine appreciation. And just like that, Malik realized that sometimes the best way to fight ignorance wasn't with anger, but with knowledge. The next day, the school felt different. The air was lighter. The tension that had once lingered in the hallways seemed to have eased. Malik noticed more students greeting him, nodding with newfound respect. Even some teachers gave him approving looks. At lunch, a small group gathered around his table, asking questions. Malik, do you think things will ever really change? One student asked. Malik took a deep breath. Change isn't instant. It takes time, effort, and people willing to learn. But yeah, I believe it can happen. Deborah, sitting nearby, spoke up. I started reading the book you suggested. I had no idea about a lot of this stuff. Malik nodded. That's the first step, educating yourself. The moment wasn't just about Deborah learning, it was about the entire school seeing the impact of knowledge over ignorance. Later that afternoon, Principal Harris called Malik to his office. At first, Malik wasn't sure why, but when he walked in, he saw a warm smile on the principal's face. You showed leadership yesterday, Principal Harris said. The school board heard about what happened, and they want to use your speech as part of an upcoming diversity program. Malik's eyes widened. Wait, seriously? Yes, Harris confirmed. What you said mattered. You changed people's perspectives, including some who didn't even realize they needed to listen. Malik walked out of the office with a sense of pride. He hadn't just defended himself, he had sparked a conversation that would last far beyond a single school assembly. As he stepped into the hallway, he saw a group of students discussing his speech. Some were debating, others were nodding in agreement. Either way, people were talking, thinking, and questioning. And that, Malik realized, was how real change began. If you were inspired by Malik's story, remember, change starts with you. Speak up against injustice, educate yourself, and stand for what's right. Share this story, start a conversation, and be the reason someone thinks differently today. Together, we can make the world a more just and understanding place.